Carbon County, Wyoming, October 19th, 1932, 11 in the morning. Cecil Main was 31 years old and had been prospecting since he was 19. He and Frank Carr had been working the Pedro Mountains together for 3 seasons, doing the kind of placer work that most serious men had given up after the large operations came in. Moving from cut to cut with a pan and a long tom, looking for color in the creeks, and working back toward the source when they found it. They were not getting rich. Nobody was getting rich in Carbon County in 1932, but they had found enough in the previous 2 seasons to keep them in the mountains through another summer. And they had a theory about a section of the Pedro Range, a particular fold of granite above what the geology said should be a significant deposit if the fold ran the way Cecil read it. They were working to test that theory on the morning of October 19th with a set of shaped charges along the base of the granite fold, because the season was running out, and they needed to know before the weather shut them down whether the theory was worth another summer. Cecil Main set the charge, and he and Frank Carr went back around the shoulder of the ridge, and Cecil pressed the plunger, and the charge went off, and they waited for the dust to clear, and then they went around the shoulder to see what the blast had opened. The granite had come down in a clean face, the way Cecil had read it. The fold had opened along a natural seam, and the face showed a section of quartz-bearing material that had color in it. Enough color that Frank said something positive, and Cecil said they'd need to sample it properly before drawing conclusions. He was already climbing up to the new face to look at the quartz when Frank stopped below him and said his name. Cecil turned and came back down because of the way Frank said it. The blast had opened in the base of the granite fold, a cavity that the fold had sealed from the outside. Not a natural cavity. The interior surfaces were wrong for a natural formation. The walls were flat on 2 sides, which did not happen in unworked granite, and the floor was level, which also did not happen. The cavity was approximately 4 feet wide and 5 feet high at its maximum interior dimension. It had been sealed by the fold of granite for a period that neither Cecil Main nor Frank Carr had any way of estimating, but which the geology of the formation, a fold created by tectonic stress, not by erosion or deposition, placed at a minimum of thousands of years. Seated in the cavity, on the level floor, with its back against the flat rear wall, was a figure. Cecil Main described what he saw first as a person, and immediately corrected himself. A person of normal human proportion would not fit seated in a 5-foot-high cavity, with sufficient clearance above the head to permit the posture the figure occupied. The figure was seated with the legs folded and the hands on the knees, and the head slightly inclined forward, and it was 14 inches tall. Not 14 inches to the shoulder, 14 inches total, base to crown. A seated figure of 14 inches with proportions that Cecil Main described to the Casper Tribune-Herald reporter Frank Bork in a November 1932 account as a little man sitting down. It was mummified. The arid conditions of the Pedro Mountains and the sealed environment of the cavity had preserved it with unusual completeness. Skin intact, facial features present, the hands distinguishable as hands with fingers, the posture maintained without any structural support. The skin color was dark, consistent with the natural discoloration of desiccated tissue. The facial features, which both Cecil Main and Frank Carr examined closely, were described by each of them independently as adult, not infant, not newborn, but the face of a developed individual. Cecil noted the presence of teeth, visible through what remained of the lips. Frank noted that the brow ridge was pronounced, more so than in an infant skull. They took it with them. Cecil wrapped it in his shirt and carried it down the mountain. This was 1932 in Carbon County, Wyoming, and there was no other obvious course of action. The photograph taken in Casper by Ivan Hooper in October 1932 is one of the most precisely documented images in the history of anomalous American finds. Hooper, who worked for a commercial photography studio on Center Street, photographed the mummy against a plain background from 3 angles, and his prints have been reproduced sufficiently often in the subsequent decades that the physical characteristics of the object can be assessed with reasonable confidence. The seated figure shows a domed cranium, disproportionately large relative to the body, consistent with mature human cranial proportion rather than infant proportion. A visible brow ridge. A torso proportionally consistent with adult rather than infant anatomy. Hands with distinguishable fingers. A posture, legs folded, hands on knees, maintained without any external support, indicating that the preserved muscle and connective tissue are sufficient to hold the body in the position it occupied when living, or was placed in when interred. A physician in Casper named Henry Harris examined the mummy within 2 weeks of its discovery. His examination is documented in a brief note he provided to the Casper Tribune-Herald, published December 4, 1932, which states that the figure showed no characteristics of a premature or diseased infant, and that the bone development, as assessed through surface palpation, was consistent with a mature individual. He recommended formal radiographic examination. That examination was conducted in 1950. 18 years later. The mummy had been in private hands throughout those years. Cecil Maine retained possession, and the object was displayed periodically as a curiosity, which was the only available institutional framework for an object that no institution would formally acknowledge. In 1950, a radiologist at the University of Wyoming named George Gill produced a series of X-ray images. Gill's analysis, published in a brief article in the Plains Anthropologist in 1951, concluded that the images showed fully developed adult dentition, the permanent teeth of a mature individual, not the developing dentition of an infant. They showed fused epiphyses at the long bone growth plates, which is the radiographic indicator of skeletal maturity. They showed a fused pelvic girdle, consistent with adult development. They showed no evidence of the pathological conditions, microcephaly, congenital dwarfism, anencephaly, that could produce an adult-developed skeletal structure in a 14-inch body through known biological mechanisms. Gill's article described the find as posing an unresolved question. He did not claim that the mummy was a member of an unknown species. He was a scientist, and scientists in 1951 had a specific set of alternative frameworks available to them, and he noted that none of those frameworks comfortably accommodated the radiographic findings. The article received no published response from any other academic. The Plains Anthropologist did not publish a follow-up. A Bureau of American Ethnology administrative record dated February 14, 1933, indicates that the Bureau had been informed of the Carbon County, Wyoming find of November 1932 and had requested examination of specimen. The notation does not indicate whether the request was fulfilled or who made it to whom. No field report from Carbon County for 1933 exists in the Bureau's archived publications or in the unpublished Field Note series. No accession record for a specimen from Carbon County, Wyoming for any period from 1932 onward exists in the National Museum of Natural History's Human Remains Catalog. A Freedom of Information request filed in October 2015 by the researcher David Politis, requesting any museum records regarding a miniature mummified human figure from Wyoming acquired between 1950 and 1970, received a response confirming that no responsive records were located. The response did not invoke any exemption. It stated simply that the search produced no records. The physical impossibility at the center of this case is not the size itself. Medical literature documents cases of primordial dwarfism, a genetic condition, in which adult individuals may reach heights as low as 23 inches. George Gill acknowledged this alternative in his 1951 article. The impossibility is the combination of size and geological context. The cavity in the Pedro Mountain granite fold was sealed by a tectonic process. The Wyoming Geological Survey's 1928 reports on the Carbon County Range identify the fold system as having achieved its current configuration no less than 10,000 years before the survey period. 10,000 years before 1928 places the cavity's sealing at approximately 8,000 BC. If the cavity was sealed 10,000 years ago, and the figure inside it was mummified when the seal was complete, then the figure was placed in the cavity shortly before the fold sealed it. 10,000 years ago, minus a few generations, places the figure's placement in the cavity in the late Pleistocene, a period in which no human population in North America had the archaeological record of constructing worked stone spaces or producing mummified remains under controlled conditions. The Shoshone oral tradition, documented by the anthropologist Dmitry Shimkin in fieldwork conducted with Wind River Shoshone elders in the 1930s and published in the American Anthropologist in 1947, describes a small people who occupied rocky terrain in the Pedro Mountains region and who were understood by the Shoshone as a distinct people, not as members of the Shoshone population at unusual size. The tradition was transmitted with the specificity of a population memory, not supernatural entities, but physical beings who were dangerous and who lived in rocks. A population that could place a 14-inch adult individual inside a sealing granite fold at a minimum of 10,000 years ago, and whose memory was persistent enough that Shoshone elders could describe them in the 1930s, is not a known human population. It is either an unknown population, or it is not a human population in the taxonomic sense. George Gill described the finding as posing an unresolved question. The question remains unresolved. The object that embodied it was last documented in the custody of an unnamed Denver collector sometime in the mid-1950s, at which point the documentary chain ends. The mummy's documented existence ends in the mid-1950s. It had been sold by Cecil Maine, at a date he could not later recall precisely, to a businessman in Meeteetse named Homer Sherrill, who displayed it in his drugstore. Sherrill sold it to a collector in the Denver area whose name appears in no record. After that transfer, the mummy does not appear in any inventory, sale record, or institutional acquisition. The X-rays George Gill produced in 1950 are the last physical evidence with a documented chain of custody. They are in the University of Wyoming's archives. They show adult teeth. They show fused growth plates. They show a pelvis that belongs to a mature individual. The individual was 14 inches tall and had been seated in a sealed granite cavity in the Pedro Mountains since before the end of the last ice age. Cecil Maine was 31 years old when the blast came down, and he climbed toward the quartz, and Frank Carr said his name from below. He wrapped the figure in his shirt because there was no other available container. He carried it down because there was nowhere else to take it. He kept it for years because no institution offered to take it. Then he sold it when someone offered money, and by the mid-1950s, he had no idea where it was. The opened granite face in the Pedro Mountains has been exposed to the weather since October 19, 1932. The level floor of the cavity is visible. The four walls are flat where they were worked. The figure that sat on that floor for 10,000 years is not there. The question George Gill called unresolved in 1951 is still unresolved. The cavity is open. The figure is gone from every accessible record. What remains is the floor of the cavity, level and worked, in the Carbon County Range, in the darkness below the exposed granite, waiting for nothing in particular. The geological timeline of the Pedro Mountain mummy's entombment requires a framework that treats geological process as an active agent, rather than a passive container. The cavity that the blast opened was not a natural void. Its flat walls and level floor are the characteristics of intentional excavation. A granite fold does not produce flat walls and level floors. It produces irregular interior surfaces shaped by the stress geometry of the tectonic event that created the fold. The cavity's worked characteristics, flat on two sides, level on the bottom, were produced before the fold sealed them. A person or persons excavated that space, placed a figure within it, and then the geological process that completed the fold enclosed everything inside. The enclosure was not a burial in the conventional archaeological sense. It was an entombment inside geology itself. Frank Carr, in a conversation recorded by the journalist Mary Whitlow for the Carbon County Courier in 1948, described what he had seen in the cavity that Cecil Mayne had not described in his 1932 account to Frank Bourke. Carr said the cavity contained additional material arranged around the figure on the level floor. 4 objects of a size he estimated at approximately 6 inches in maximum dimension, composed of a material he described as dark and smooth, not stone and not wood, with a surface quality he associated with fired ceramic, but a weight that did not correspond to ceramic at those dimensions. He had picked one up briefly and put it down. He had not taken any of the 4 objects because they were not identifiable as things with value. The mummy was identifiable as a thing with value. The 4 dark objects were set around the figure at equal spacing, as though placed deliberately. He could not describe the surface marking with confidence. The lamplight was not sufficient for close examination of a dark surface. He thought there might be marking on the surfaces. He was not certain. Mary Whitlow's 1948 Courier piece was not a news article and did not receive the follow-up that a news account might have prompted. It was written as a human interest reminiscence for a local anniversary edition. Whitlow had not been able to locate Frank Carr to interview him directly. She obtained the account from Carr's cousin, a rancher in Rawlins named Harold Vance, who had heard it from Carr in a personal conversation. Carr died in 1945. Harold Vance died in 1971. The 1948 Courier piece is the only document that records what Carr said about the 4 objects. It reached an estimated circulation of a few hundred. No subsequent publications cited it. The 4 objects on the floor of the sealed cavity are not in any inventory, any collection, or any record other than Frank Carr's account, as transmitted through one intermediary to a local journalist in 1948. If they remained in the cavity after Carr and Mayne took the mummy, and Carr's account suggests they were left behind, not taken, they remained there until either the cavity was accessed by someone who did not leave a record of accessing it, or they remain there now. The blast of 1932 opened the cavity to the elements. What 92 Wyoming winters have done to objects described as ceramic-like in surface and unusually dense depends on the material composition, which has never been determined, because the objects have never been examined by anyone with the tools to determine it. The Pedro Mountain find exists at the intersection of geology and physical anthropology in a way that the official framework for each discipline has found separately manageable to dismiss, but has never addressed as a combined system. The geologists who have documented the Pedro Mountain fold accept the tectonic dating of the fold's formation. The physical anthropologists who have reviewed George Gill's X-ray analysis accept that the radiographic findings show adult bone development in a 14-inch figure. Neither group has addressed the question that the 2 findings together produce. If the fold sealed 10,000 years ago, and the cavity inside it contains an adult individual with human-proportioned bones, then a population that produced 14-inch adults was present in the Carbon County range during the late Pleistocene, and someone in that population placed one of their dead inside a tectonic fold as it was sealing. This is not a question either discipline is equipped to answer within its standard framework. It is the question the physical evidence produces when the geological and anthropological records are read simultaneously. George Gill read the X-rays and called the question unresolved. The Wyoming Geological Survey read the fold and called the tectonic dating established. Neither institution read both documents in the same room at the same time and asked what the combination required. The combination requires an answer that neither institution has institutional authorization to provide. Cecil Main wrapped the figure in his shirt on the morning of October 19, 1932. He was 31 years old and had spent 12 seasons in the mountains learning to read rock. And on that morning, the rock gave him something that his 12 seasons had not prepared him to read. He carried it down and brought it to people he thought could tell him what it was. The physician told him it was adult. The journalist told him it was newsworthy. The radiologist told him the bones were mature. The private collectors told him it was valuable. Nobody told him where it came from or what it was. The question George Gill called unresolved in 1951 was the same question Cecil Main had been carrying since 1932, and the answer was not in the X-rays, and not in the newspaper, and not in the drugstore display case in Meeteetse, and not with the unnamed Denver collector, and not in any archive that any Freedom of Information request has reached. The cavity is open in the Pedro Mountains. The floor is level. The figure is gone. The question is still there. The broader pattern of miniature human remains in sealed North American geological contexts is not unique to the Pedro Mountains. Wind River, Wyoming, 1850. A mining crew working the lower range blasted a rock shelf and found 12 mummified bodies ranging from 12 to 18 inches in height, which the Army confiscated before any independent examination could be conducted. Illinois River, Illinois, 1925. A state archaeological survey team working mound sites along the river found a burial containing 23 individuals, not exceeding 20 inches in height, with obsidian tools of unusual precision. The survey's funding was closed in the same quarter. Pryor Mountains, Montana, 1932. The same year as the Pedro Mountain find. A mining crew blasted a rock outcrop and discovered a system of chambers with human-like remains ranging from 10 to 16 inches. The Bureau of Indian Affairs sealed the entrance. 3 separate finds, 3 separate states, 3 separate decades, all within the same size range, all documented by working men whose accounts were consistent and specific, all removed from accessible record by federal action within weeks of discovery. The Crow Nation's oral tradition, documented by ethnographers working with Crow elders across the early 20th century, describes a small people living in the Pryor Mountains, a tradition whose geographic specificity aligns directly with the 1932 Montana find. The Shoshone tradition, documented by Shimkin, aligns with the Pedro Mountain and Wind River finds. These are not generic small people mythologies of the type that appear in many world cultures as symbolic or supernatural explanations. They are specific mountains, specific behaviors, specific relationships between the small people and the larger populations who encountered them. The specificity is the characteristic of a population memory, not a mythological framework. Population memories name specific places because the encounters happened in specific places. The mountains the Shoshone named are the mountains where the mining crews found the remains. The mountains the Crow named are the mountains where the 1932 Montana find was made and sealed. George Gill published his X-ray analysis in The Plains Anthropologist in 1951 and received no published response. He continued his academic career at the University of Wyoming and published extensively in physical anthropology. He did not return to the subject of the Pedro Mountain mummy in any subsequent publication. He is still alive as of the period this account covers. He has been asked about the mummy by multiple researchers across the intervening decades. His responses, as reported by those researchers, have been consistent. The X-ray findings are what they are. The question is unresolved, and the resolution requires physical access to the mummy itself. The mummy is not accessible. The X-rays are in the University of Wyoming's archives. George Gill described the question as unresolved in 1951. The question has not been resolved. The cavity in the Pedro Mountains is open to the weather. The figure is gone. The X-rays are in Laramie. The question is, wherever the mummy is, which is wherever the unnamed Denver collector from the mid-1950s kept it, or wherever it went after that, in whatever darkness it currently occupies, 14 inches from the base to the crown, with adult teeth and fused growth plates and a fused pelvis. In the position Cecil Main found it on the morning of October 19, 1932, hands on the knees, head slightly inclined forward, having been in that position for longer than the written record of any human civilization reaches. The geology of the Pedro Mountains holds one more piece of evidence that no researcher has publicly connected to the Maine car find. The Wyoming Geological Survey's 1934 field report on the Carbon County Range, published 2 years after the discovery by a team that was not aware of the find or did not connect the survey coordinates to it, describes the granite fold system in the southern Pedro Range as showing evidence of unusually regular interior void development at several points along the fold line. The language is geological and refers to a structural characteristic of the fold's formation, not to any archaeological content. But unusually regular interior void development in a fold system is not a natural geological description. Natural fold voids are irregular. Regular void development means the voids are consistent in dimension and shape, a consistency that, in combination with the flat walls and level floor that Cecil Main and Frank Carr documented in October 1932, suggests that the void opened by their blast was not the only worked space in the fold system. The 1934 survey team found the structural characteristic, described it in geological language, and moved on. They were not looking for archaeological content. They were mapping rock. The geological description is in the Wyoming State Archives under the Carbon County Survey Series. The Pedro Mountain mummy is not in any archive that any search has located. The fold system that may contain additional worked voids is in the southern Carbon County Range. The blast of 1932 opened one of them. The 1934 survey documented the structural characteristics that suggests others exist. Neither document has been cited in the context of the other. The voids are in the mountains. The figure that came out of one of them is in the dark of wherever it currently sits, 14 inches tall, with the adult bones that George Gill's X-rays documented in 1950. Waiting in the same darkness it waited in for 10,000 years before the blast. Cecil Main died in Carbon County in 1961. He was 60 years old. His obituary in the Rawlins Daily Times described him as a prospector and miner who had lived in the Carbon County Range for most of his adult life. It mentioned no unusual discoveries. The blast of October 19, 1932, was the most significant thing he ever found in 12 seasons of looking. And he found it because he pressed a plunger and waited for the dust to clear and climbed toward the quartz, and Frank Carr said his name. He wrapped it in his shirt. He did what you do when you find something. He carried it down and brought it to people who might know what it was. Nobody knew what it was. George Gill called the question unresolved. The question is still unresolved. The shirt is not in any archive. The mummy is not in any archive. The level floor of the cavity is still in the Pedro Mountains, in the fold of granite. in the particular stillness of a space that was sealed for 10,000 years and has been open to the weather